guys, welcome back to the channel. Today's Down and Dirty was a request by one of my subscribers. They wanted to know, how does flotation work? How does wide tracks make a machine float better? And I've always taken this for granted because I've been in the industry for so long, but I'm sure for a lot of you guys just getting into it, yeah, that is kind of confusing. Why are there all these different dozer configurations? So let's start by talking about dozer configurations themselves. There's generally three dozer configurations. There's going to be an XLT, which is going to be for an extra long track. There's going to be a WT, which is wide track. Or there's going to be an LGP, which stands for low ground pressure. All of these terms are talking about one thing specifically: how wide are the tracks on the dozer? As you can see here, I've got a Case 2050M. This is an XLT configuration, which means it is a low ground pressure machine, if you will. It does not have wide tracks. This is kind of your narrow track gauge setup. And then here we have a D5K that is an LGP, low ground pressure. You can see that those tracks, even though this machine is almost twice the size, are roughly the same width. What is that doing for us? Which, by the way, one more aspect of the machine that changes that I didn't ever really think about until I started selling equipment. When you change the track width, the machine physically gets wider, right? Because we're adding wider tracks to it. That means the dozer blade also has to get wider, because if we kept the same dozer blade width, but we made our tracks wider, now all of a sudden the dozer wouldn't doze wide enough to cover our track base. So there are two aspects of the machine that change when you start upping the track gauge. It's not only the tracks themselves, but it's actually the blade width. So that being said, why do we mess around with different track configurations? Well, this is actually, when you start to think about it, a fairly straightforward concept. Let's talk about snowshoes. Why do people wear snowshoes? Well, it's actually for the exact same reason. If you step in snow with just your foot, you have a relatively small footprint, but you have a lot of weight that's pressing down on one foot. Let's imagine we're in the snow and we're standing on one leg like a flamingo. That's a lot of weight pushing down on one foot. And as we all know, you do that and you're gonna sink right down in the snow. But what if we put on a snowshoe and we increased our footprint by a factor of 4 or 5? Well, now all of a sudden I weigh right at 200 pounds. Now all of a sudden, instead of 200 pounds being focused on something just a little bigger than my hand, we have 200 pounds that's, got this really good sized footprint. It's gonna dissipate that pressure across more of the snow. So instead of sinking down 6 inches, I may only sink about 2 or 3 inches into the snow because the weight is being dispersed. That's exactly why track machines work really well in rough conditions, is because let's just take this XLT. We've already taken our footprint from let's compare to our loader here, because they're not going to be super far off in weight. Look at the ground pressure on this. We have the entire weight of this loader resting on this little bottom area of the wheels. And I'm just making sure that my stuff is in focus here. That's a very, very small area. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces of the wheel on the ground. There's only 4 points of contact when this machine is sitting on the ground, versus this machine weighing in probably a little more even. We have now taken it and we're dispersing that weight across the entire length of the track multiplied by the width of the track. That's substantially more area that we're spreading the weight of this machine out on. And that's why you can take this machine and run it over the ground. And if you've ever watched a wheel loader with a full bucket go over the ground, you actually see the ground compress and then raise back up. Yet you don't see that so much with dozers. And it's because more of that weight's being dispersed across the length of the dozer track. But in wet conditions, we can do better. We need to do better, because this machine in wet conditions will bog right down. It's going to get stuck. That's why we go to an LGP configuration. Now we've taken that ground pressure and we've spread it way out. It's like we take the entire length of the track and put snowshoes on it. We've now taken our ground pressure from, and I don't know what actual numbers are, but let's call it 11 pounds per square inch or 15 pounds per square inch here, and we've reduced it down to 5 to 6 pounds per square inch here. You've cut your ground pressure in half, which means you are able to ride up on that soft material that much better, almost by a factor of 2. That's why we change track widths. It's the exact same with excavators or any other tracked machine. That's why we use track machines, is because we're spreading out ground pressure. Now, the natural question that comes out of this is, Brian, why don't we equip every dozer in the world with LGP tracks? If it gives us that much better flotation, why don't we do it to everything? Well, that's where you have the downside. There are a couple downsides to LGP tracks or just wider tracks in general. First of all, if you can imagine, this little dozer has almost the exact same amount of track on the ground as this dozer here as far as width is concerned. That means that when I turn this machine, that's putting a tremendous amount of strain on the track chain, on the pads, and your rollers and sprockets. You're putting way more strain on your undercarriage in an LGP machine because you have that much more track on the ground. And again, think about it from a snowshoe standpoint. If I have my regular boot in the ground and I turn my foot, I can turn my foot relatively easy within the snow. But if I have that snowshoe on and I'm trying to turn my foot, there's going to be a lot more friction and a lot more resistance because of how much larger my footprint is. So one of the primary reasons we don't put LGP tracks on every single machine out there is because it costs a lot more to maintain the undercarriage of a wide track or an LGP machine than it does a standard carriage dozer. That's number one. Number two, and this is actually demonstrated a lot more when you're pushing snow in a skid steer. We'll get to that. Number two is when you have more flotation, that means by definition, you don't have as much down pressure pushing down on your tracks, which means you don't get as good of traction. This dozer, if we were to put it right next to its big brother, the LGP version of the 2050, this dozer in dry conditions could push substantially more material than its LGP counterpart. That's just because we have more weight pushing down on those tracks, giving us more dig power into the dirt. It's getting more forward traction because there's more weight pushing those grousers into the dirt. Versus this LGP machine, yeah, we've got great flotation, but that means that these grousers are not being shoved down in the dirt with as much pressure as its XL counterpart. And so that's why we don't put, that's another reason we don't put LGP tracks on every machine. So now going back to our skid steer example, if you've ever heard someone claim that a track skid steer pushes snow better than a wheeled skid steer, you can immediately discount that person for having any knowledge whatsoever. That could not be further from the truth for the exact same concept we just talked about, except now we've applied it to slick conditions as opposed to muddy soup. So we get out on the snow with a wheeled machine. Again, let's take our loader. You've only got 4 little parts of contact, right? That's a lot of machine weight pushing down on 4 little points of contact, which means we're gonna cut through that ice, we're gonna push through that snow, and we're gonna get grippy with those tires. Versus if I take my skid steer out there, I'm spreading the entire weight of that machine across a 10 to 12 foot section of the ground. Well, how am I supposed to get traction now? I don't have any down pressure really pushing through that snow to grip the asphalt that's underneath. So those are the 2 primary reasons we don't put LGP tracks on every machine. It's far more expensive to maintain and you don't get as good of traction. But in the right applications, especially up here in Michigan where it's wet all the time, you have a lot of soft soils, wide track and LGP tracks reign supreme because they give you better flotation. So I hope this has been helpful, kind of breaking down why we have these tracks, what they do, and why we don't put them on every machine. As always, feel free to ask questions down below, and we'll catch you guys on the next Down and Dirty.